all, and welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I look at what's making headlines here in Western Australia by reading through letters to the editor in my local newspaper, the West Australian. First up this week, a missing ingredient, 25th of March 2015. What a great letter from Heather Clarkson, one teacher, 51 pupils and the cane, 23rd of March, in which she talks about how a solitary teacher educated 51 students at North Inglewood Primary School in the 1950s. Of course, another element at the time would have been 102 responsible and respectful parents. Reese Winterburn, City Beach. Again, so this is on the back of a letter where somebody wrote in saying that they were a teacher and they had 51 students in their class in the 50s, and because they had caning, they were able to maintain discipline, and so that's, why we can't maintain discipline in classes that size these days. And this person writes in to suggest that the other big thing is that, you had 102 responsible and respectful parents. There's so many things wrong with this. Firstly, the fact that one teacher managed to do that with one class in the 1950s is hardly good evidence that discipline back then was less of a problem than it is now because of the caning, etc., etc. I have no doubt in my mind that you could easily put 51 primary school kids in a class these days and have a teacher successfully manage that class. You could assemble a class like that. What I'm more interested in is, could you do that with more classes now than you could have done back then? So the fact that it happened in one class is hardly of note. The second thing is, this is somebody's recollections from 60 years later. And we all know that with our nostalgia and our rosy retrospection, we're going to remember this probably better than it actually was. So I suspect strongly that it probably wasn't the glorious, well-behaved class that it seems to be in memory. The other thing is that education in the 1950s was quite different here in Australia than it is today. In particular, compulsory education in the 50s, I think it was just being extended to include some of high school. So year 8, 9 and 10 basically started to become compulsory. But compulsory education, primary school education, while that was on the books legally, was not enforced. So the children you had attending school were much more likely to be in this case, from middle-class families who did value education and did instill a respect for teachers and authority figures in their kids. And so you are less likely to have issues with with the classes in the 50s than you are today, because today we take our compulsory education a little bit more seriously. And I'm not sure what North Inglewood was like back in the 50s, but there are a hell of a lot of areas here in the state now where children are coming, as this so rightly points out. It's not that parents in general are less responsible and respectful. It's just that those parents who aren't responsible and respectful are nowadays much more forced into keeping their kids in school, whereas in the 50s they simply weren't. And if their kids were truant, truancy was a much bigger issue back then, and if their kids were truant, the authorities didn't make a huge effort to get the ratbag kids of ratbad parents into classes. And so the comparison is simply a false one. And to suggest that corporal punishment is the solution it flies in the face of all the evidence. The evidence is not there for that. There is no good evidence that that kind of disciplinary approach actually works. And even if it did, it might have been necessary if you had to have class sizes of 51. Nowadays we don't. We're much more affluent. We can... the 51 students in the 1950s who were better behaved, say, assuming that's true, would have learnt a lot less than the smaller class sizes we have now. So in a way, that's a reasonable trade-off for us to say that we're going to have smaller classes so that we have better educational outcomes, and as a result, we're not going to need to use the cane. Simply the suggestion that there was these glory days of the 1950s where children were well behaved because otherwise they would be beaten is simply not borne out by historical truth. Next up, Union of Opposites, 26th of March 2015. Marriage is an exclusive union between a man and a woman. If it is not this, then what is it? According to Conrad Oliveris, it's a person's love. Marriage equality benefits the whole community. Opinion, 25th of March. Based on this foundation, where would marriage as such stop? Why couldn't a party of 3, of whatever sexes, then claim the so-called right to marriage equality and proclaim discrimination if denied? No logical reason at all. I have yet to hear a reasoned and coherent argument for changing the current understanding and basis for marriage, in spite of the emotive verbiage that is put out by those trying to change it. M. Rose Sorrento. Good point. Absolutely. If we extend marriage equality, on the basis that people who are arguing for marriage equality are making, that it is an artificial limitation to specify that marriage is between a man and a woman, on that same argument, if there is no harm in that, if you can't demonstrate that there's a harm in having marriage between multiple partners, then we perhaps should extend marriage equality. I'm actually kind of in favour of that. I've done a video about this on Secular TV. I'll put a link in the description box. And basically, as far as I'm concerned, I can see, in principle, I have no real objection to polygamy or polyamory or multiple marriage like that. In practice, the way it is practiced in Western societies is it's generally practiced by exclusive fundamentalist religious cults, and there's a hell of a lot of harm that comes from it. So it is, given the way that our society, the history that it has, polygamy is a fairly reliable indicator of spousal abuse, but not because of polygamy in itself, but rather because it's strongly associated with these sort of fringe, cultish, fundamentalist religious groups. The actual practice of allowing consenting adults to form whatever relationships they want, I have no real objection to. I've heard people argue, and I think it's reasonable, that the government actually should get out of the business of caring about marriages per se. Essentially, the valid interest that a government has in social stability is probably best thought of as households, and that what they should be trying to promote is stable households. Whether that is in marriages in particular, or whether that's other living arrangements for the raising of children, etc., etc. But probably we should be moving away from thinking about marriage as being something that should be state-sanctioned and should come with rewards and benefits. It certainly seems to me that it is very arbitrary to simply, or at least it's based only in a tradition which is not universal, and certainly not universal in the history of Western civilization. And so it's a sort of a cherry-picked tradition that says that marriage should be one man, one woman. And I don't find tradition to be a particularly useful argument in this case. I think, it's been fairly conclusively proven that there's no real detriment to allowing same-sex marriages. In fact, there seems to be a lot of benefits. That it is basically discriminatory against homosexual people. But I think the same argument, as this person points out, there's not a hell of a stretch to say that it's kind of arbitrary to talk about marriage as being an exclusive union. I can't really see that there's a big argument against bigamy or polygamy, except for the ways that it is generally has been practiced in our recent history. As an aside, biblical marriage, if you want to get your basis from the Bible, which I certainly don't, but biblical marriage, especially the Old Testament, is polygamous. It isn't simply a man and a woman. It's a man and as many women as he can manage, plus concubines, plus affairs, plus servants, plus his wife's servants, plus the widow of his dead brother. There's certainly no, within the Jewish tradition, it's certainly not a straightforward man-woman thing. Certainly the Christians have sort of pushed that, and to a degree maybe they have a bit more of a claim to having a continuous sort of usage of marriage in that sense. But my basis is if there's no real harm in it, and I can't see any harm directly in same-sex or polygamous marriages, then I don't think it's really the government's business to be arbitrarily deciding. There you go. Top Gear axing is politically correct, 27th of March, 2015. While not condoning any physical violence allegedly committed by Jeremy Clarkson of the Top Gear show, all I can say is how thin-skinned we have become. BBC puts brakes on Clarkson's career, news 26th of March. Here was a man who bucked the trend towards political correctness. He said what he liked. But, judging by reactions, free speech is no longer free. Individuals seem to feel that their offence at something should make it illegal. But not all of us are offended by what may offend others. Let us all bow down now before the altar of political correctness. Stuart Smith, Kalamunda. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, Jeremy Clarkson is a British TV personality who hosted their one of their top shows, Top Gear, which is a motoring show, and he's fairly notorious, and he's been sacked. And it comes off an incident in which he had an altercation or a fracas. He basically had an argument with a producer while they were doing some filming, and is alleged to have assaulted the producer. And so he's been sacked. And it comes on a string of other sort of incidents that the BBC were not too happy about. And there's several things going on here. So firstly, he was sacked because he is alleged to have assaulted this producer. That seems to me fairly reasonable. If any employee of any organisation probably shouldn't be able to keep their job if they are assaulting other staff members, especially staff members who are their subordinates in this case. He's the big star. He's the sort of the big man on set. So the person he assaulted was definitely very much on the lower end of the power dynamic. And so I think that's reasonable. Now, if we want to talk about standards of proof, generally speaking, yes, he hasn't been convicted in a court of law. He may never be convicted. There may not be sufficient evidence. I don't know. Courts of law for trying criminal things have a very high standard of proof because we take the idea of innocent till proven guilty and proof beyond reasonable doubt or whatever very seriously. But if I'm an employer or I'm part of an organisation, I have a duty of care to my employees. And if I have an employee who is alleged to have assaulted another employee and there is reasonable grounds upon which I can draw the conclusion that that probably happened or is likely to have happened, I may not be able to have enough evidence for that person to be convicted, but it still can be reasonable for me to take steps on the basis of a slightly lower standard of proof. I mean, for example, in civil cases, the proof only has to be within the balance of probability. So, on the balance of probability, so it only needs to be proven more likely than not. And I think in a sort of industrial relations setting, I think that's perfectly reasonable. I mean, I'm not even sure what the legality is here, because it could well be that Clarkson is on some kind of contract that they could just terminate based on him bringing the BBC into disrepute or something. So they might actually be... I mean, if I have an employee who's on short-term contract, or who's a casual employee that I don't have any kind of... that I can stop employing at any time, and I hear that it's alleged that they've assaulted another staff member, and I have some reason to think that it's probably the case, I would feel very justified in cutting their hours and not employing them anymore, even though I couldn't prove it to the satisfaction of a court. And I think that is perfectly reasonable here. That said, that's for the case of physical assault. Now, the previous incidents have generally been about political correctness. That is, he's said things and done things that have been not politically correct and have upset a segment of the community. And the BBC have been upset by that and sort of threatened to sack him or do something about it. This kind of comes in along the line of that, and so that may have played into this or not, but I would have thought that assaulting somebody else, another employee, would have been sufficient grounds to get rid of him in of itself. Now, should the BBC get rid of presenters if they are unpolitically correct? Now, there's two ways of looking at this. The BBC is a public institution that receives funding from the from taxpayers and sort of the community in general, and so really needs to be answerable to that community in some sense. That places it in a sort of difficult place. So, on one hand, it is reasonable to expect the BBC to broadcast a variety of opinions, and therefore to not be a homogenous lump of just politically correct people in the worst possible sense of that. So we should expect it to air somewhat controversial content. On the other hand, if a significant chunk of those people who are paying the bills for it, the community at large, are upset at the actions of somebody on that, then also they should be responsive to the community at large. And so I'm not sure what the particular sort of balance is in this case. I'm not an English person, I don't watch Top Gear, I don't really like Jeremy Clarkson, but I don't actually know him very well because I've only seen a little bit of it. So I'm not really sure where it stands on this. But the thing is here is that isn't even really about free speech. It's only sort of slightly about free speech. In that, Jeremy Clarkson is free to say whatever he wants. He lives in a society that has, well, libel laws notwithstanding, in a society that has fairly strong free speech laws. I mean, he can publish a personal blog, he can write letters to the editor. He can put whatever he wants up on YouTube, and the government is not going to stop it. Nobody's going to censor him in that sense. And that is really all that one can expect in terms of free speech. If it's curtailing Jeremy Clarkson's free speech to take him off Top Gear, then surely it is curtailing the free speech of every other British person, and by not allowing them the same kind of platform that he's had to spew his, opinions. That is a completely unrealistic stance on free speech. I think the best you could hope is that the BBC would air a variety of opinions that should represent most of the people within their society. So if there's a significant subgroup of the society who agree with people like Jeremy Clarkson, then I think the BBC has a responsibility to air those kinds of views, people who are representative of those subgroups. But it doesn't need to be Jeremy Clarkson. It doesn't need to be on Top Gear, which is supposed to be a sort of an entertainment show rather than an informative show. It's not a particularly... it isn't a political show anyway. It's supposed to just be entertaining. And so the idea of taking somebody off a sort of light entertainment comedy show is somehow curtailing free speech. It's just rubbish. Just absolute rubbish. And I suspect that he's probably done some things that were pretty offensive to some chunks of the society. And I suspect that people were kind of gunning for him. The fact that the BBC was willing to take a significant hit to their income, probably. It's suspected that without him, Top Gear is not going to be quite the same, and that is a big money winner for them. So the fact that they were willing to get rid of him despite that kind of thing suggests that they'd run out of options because he'd actually hit somebody. No titillation in breast milk assault, 28th of March 2015. While correspondent Tom Edmonds, lactating in a lockup, letters 26th of March, may feel our police are not doing the right thing with their actions relating to Ms. Erica Leader, woman held after breast milk assault, news 26th of March, I thoroughly disagree. The fact that she is a lactating mother is not an issue, except that she allegedly used her bodily fluids to assault a police officer. Neither funny nor trivial. Andrew Bell, Woodvale. Not to discount the experiences of the police woman, I think, who was allegedly assaulted here. Actually, I do find it fairly funny. Not necessarily trivial, but certainly funny. So this woman is a lactating, I assume, a mother of a small child, and she was arrested for something, I'm not quite sure. And while being strip-searched in the police lockup, she allegedly deliberately squirted... breast milk at the female police officer who was conducting a strip search. Yes, I'm childish. I find it funny. So first, a few things. All the way through the reporting of it, as you can see in the quotes that I've given you, they've put quotations around assault. I'm not quite sure why. To me, on a sort of a legal level, it's equivalent to spitting on somebody, which is clearly an assault by any kind of reasonable sense of the word. Discharging bodily fluids on somebody is an assault. Certainly doing it on a police officer is a somewhat serious matter. Now, so I don't quite know why they've called it an assault rather than an assault. That said, I still find it kind of funny. And I don't want to say it's trivial, because it isn't. It is potentially serious, but probably not serious, in the same way that spitting is. So if I spit on somebody, the potential for harm is quite great, because it's a bodily fluid, and I might have a communicable disease or a bloodborne illness of some variety. Potentially, if I spit on somebody, I can transmit whatever illness I have. And so spitting is potentially quite a violent act, in that... so usually, if somebody deliberately infects another person with something like HIV, this is at least considered to be sort of grievous bodily harm, or even sort of other sexually transmitted diseases. So the deliberate infection of somebody else with a sexually transmitted disease is usually considered grievous bodily harm, which is the highest level of assault that we have here, short of murder or manslaughter. So... essentially spitting, and in this case, squirting breast milk on somebody, falls into a similar category. It could potentially transmit a serious illness to somebody, and therefore is a potentially serious issue. Now, in actual fact of the way that things go, is that the vast majority of the time, nothing is transmitted. It's actually quite difficult to transmit infections this way, and it's even more difficult to transmit the kinds of infections that we're actually worried about. Certainly, things like HIV and stuff it's almost impossible. And so, in reality, the way it plays out generally is that it's a big worry for the person involved that they might have contracted something and they need to go through testing, and then they don't end up contracting something, and it's actually no big deal in the long run. Not to minimise the experience of it. So although it has this potentially devastating consequences for the person, the vast majority of the time, absolutely nothing of the sort. It really is just wiped off. Now, spitting has a particular place in our culture because it carries a lot of connotations of extreme disrespect towards somebody and potentially the threat of other violence. So when you spit on somebody, it sends a communication that you so utterly disrespect that person that you don't even see them as a human. And therefore, spitting comes with a whole pile of baggage that squirting breast milk doesn't. Now, I suspect there's also something of a vaguely sexist going on here. The pictures of this woman, she's quite young, I'm pretty sure she's blonde. They got some pictures off her Facebook of her looking, they're Facebook profile pictures of a young blonde woman. So she doesn't look particularly threatening, and breast milk is not seen as offensive in the same way that spitting on somebody is. And so there is this sense in which I guess some people, it does seem hilarious, partly because it's just a woman doing it, and it's a woman doing something quintessentially female in that it's squirting breast milk. And so I think there is something in our society that, because one, we haven't traditionally used that as an insult, and I think partly that's bound up in the way that women aren't seen as being aggressive or threatening. So when they do something like that, it's not seen as having the same weight or danger as when a man does something like spitting on somebody. And so I think it's playing into that criminal double standard that we have here, whereby women are seen as less threatening, and therefore their criminal acts, which otherwise, equivalent, are seen as being less serious. And I think that is problematic. I would like to see when women do something and men do something that is functionally the same, that they get basically the same consideration. Lastly for this week, for safety's sake, 30th of March 2015, I would like to thank Lee Kuan Yew for the times I visited Singapore and how safe I felt night or day shopping and sightseeing with never a thought about mugging. A raspberry to our authorities here, where we are locked in and the scum are out and about, in stark contrast to Singapore, where they are locked in and we are safe. Faith McSwain, Woodlands. So, Lee Kuan Yew is basically the father of modern Singapore. He was in charge of Singapore to a greater or lesser extent for the entirety of Singapore's modern existence. He was part of the reason why it got independence from the British. He is a large part of the reason, if not the main reason, why Singapore became a prosperous, developed nation and an independent nation in Southeast Asia. And even after he stopped being Prime Minister, he's been very, very influential in Singaporean politics and society ever since, and he's died recently. And so there was a lot of tributes to him that came through in the newspaper. Now, in particular, there were a lot of people who were praising his approach to crime. So it was, in large part, his he was the reason why Singapore has quite a wide range of offences for which you can be caned. The fact that they have caning as a punishment for criminal offences, and the wide range under his rule, and I think driven by him, they extended it to a large number of offences. And Singapore has an incredibly low crime rate. And so a lot of people have previously argued this, and now on the back of his death in paying tribute to him, have argued that because of the corporal punishment and the strict and so it's strict on things that here in the West we generally aren't. So things like, you get caned for things like graffiti, or for chewing gum is apparently banned or something because people spit chewing gum on the floor. And so if you have chewing gum, or if you litter, that you can get caned for that as well. So there's a whole pile of things. And then, of course, as with many Southeast Asian nations, they have the death penalty for drug trafficking. And so there's a lot of people who've been lauding Mr. Lee for his tough on crime, use of corporal punishment, and as proof of the effectiveness of this, have pointed to the low crime rates, and he himself did that as well. The problem is that now, as far as I can tell, Mr. Lee probably was a fantastic thing. It was fantastic for Singapore in terms of their economic and social development. Singapore is a wonderful place and could have gone a lot worse since gaining independence, and stands out in and around Asia for its development and for the quality of life of the people who live there. But on the matter of crime, the usage of corporal punishment and strict punishment for things is not the reason why Singapore has a low crime rate. It's a very small part of it. It might be, at best, it's the reason why they probably have low levels of things like graffiti. Graffiti is the kind of crime, and probably one of the few crimes, where whacking people with a cane may well discourage repeat offenders, and you might be able to do something about graffiti. Here in the West, we generally consider the well-being of the usually juveniles who commit graffiti offences to be more important than in the long run, somewhat trivial consequences of graffiti. And so we generally strike a different balance. But in terms of violent crime, the levels of violent crime in Singapore are exceedingly low. So people are not only safe, but they also feel safe. Now here, we're not that far away, but our crime rates are relatively low by sort of world standards, but higher than Singapore. People are safe, but they don't feel as safe. Part of the problem of thinking that it's due to caning is that when we look around East Asia, and we look at the sort of other countries to which Singapore is comparable, so we look at places like Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, and probably even South Korea, so highly developed, high population density, high standards of living, Asian cultures, the crime rates for things like muggings are basically the same. Muggings and murders and violent crime. So violent crime seems to be lower across developed Asian countries for cultural reasons. Or at least we suspect it's for cultural reasons because you can't actually see those other jurisdictions don't practice corporal punishment, and we can't really. There doesn't seem to be any other better reason why, say, South Korea and Japan have lower, significantly lower violent crime rates than, say, a Norway and a Sweden. The levels of development, quality of life, all these normal things that drive crime are broadly speaking the same from Western Europe to some of those East Asian countries, but their violent crime rates are lower. Interestingly, though, their other crime rates aren't. So drug use and drug trafficking in Singapore is comparable to other places in the developed world and around East Asia. So the fact that they have the death penalty for drug trafficking doesn't seem to have changed their the criminal offences there. Their crime rates for things like white-collar crimes is comparable to every other developed country. And so what we have is a situation where there seems to be an anomaly with violent crime, and it's almost as far... and a lot of the canings and the use of corporal punishment are not for violent crimes. And therefore we can be pretty sure that the safety that people have in Singapore and feel in Singapore is not down to the use of caning. We think it's a cultural thing. And therefore, almost certainly, bringing caning here is not going to have the desired effect for all those people who think that caning is going to cause the streets to be safer. And safer than they already are. Even though the crime rates in Singapore are lower than here, the crime rates here are very low for your average person. And the kind of person who writes into the letters to the editor, who are middle-class retirees, overwhelmingly white Anglo background, the crime rates amongst that demographic are exceedingly low. And probably no higher here than they are in Singapore. It's other demographics which are experiencing most of the violent crime. Young, poor, black women, particularly. Anyway, that's it for me for this week. I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing well here. Join me next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See ya.